Okay, this is class number 7 in Introduction to Ethics, RPH 205. So, in the last lecture, we talked about the tech billionaires, Zuckerberg, Bezos, Steve Jobs, the head of Uber, and Kara Swisher is very disappointed. Turns out they're greedy. More recently, they've all stepped up and been great uh, bowed to Donald Trump once again. She was surprised when they did it 8 years ago. Now they're way more invested and way more submissive to Mr. Trump. So they did get a great education, right? Zuckerberg was Exeter and I think Harvard. Anyway, right, MIT, they go to all these fancy places. So this lecture is about the corruption of the elite universities. What's going on there? So again, there was an old-fashioned view that Plato and Aristotle were, they assumed it. All the tragedies and the epic poetry had a privileged class of people. And the expectation is that the privileged rule for the benefit of the ruled. They didn't have, they didn't found their society on equality or freedom. They founded it on practical wisdom. And then there, not everybody could be educated, but it was a responsibility of educated people to use their privilege to create a middle class. So the art of statecraft, creating a middle class, is really important for preserving stability and preserving especially democracy. Again, the elite got corrupt in Athens and they lost their democracy. And for Aristotle, it's just a matter of identity. Like it's way more respectable to be good at statecraft than making money. Making money is not valued. A city based on money is barbarism because it's a lower level of human functioning. Being able to provide an environment where people can flourish is way more honorable and challenging, but in a good way. So you try to get your privileged class of young people to really want to do that. They want to be good leaders. Leadership, not making money. But that is not the society we have. And so I have you reading two different readings. One is The Illusion of Wisdom from Glenn Hedges' book, and also The Disadvantages of an Elite Education by William Dershowitz, who wrote Excellent Sheep also. And then I also had a short article from the Chronicle of Education, Higher Education, about philosophy, and that's my discipline, philosophy as blood sport. And she talks about the blogs of professional philosophers and how horrible they are, how they're black and white and they're competitive and adversarial and they're anyway, I don't I've never been to one. I don't think I don't have one and I've never been on a blog because I really don't even think it's thinking. Thinking is talking to people, it's dialogue, it's community. Anyway, it's just, I'm honestly surprised that anybody does think it's philosophy. It's not the love of wisdom. The love of wisdom is difficult. The ability to make good judgments in particular situations is super difficult. You certainly can't do it asynchron, in an asynchronous way, which of course is ironic since I'm creating an asynchronous class. But I would definitely like my students to meet with me on Zoom or stop by my office if they're in town. But, this is the best we can do, and I hope I come across at least as somebody who's interested in dialogue and not professing. I do have to tell you things you don't know, like what's going on in those elite universities. That I will profess, but that's in order to encourage you to think for yourself and have your own mind, and don't passively accept these people as celebrities or as somehow virtuous, because they're not. Even though they're smart, even though they get into these elite institutions, those are the ones to be most afraid of. Alcibiades was the worst. Um, Athens fell because of smart people that had the wrong goals. So here we go. Um, Here's the chapter from The Illusion of Wisdom, chapter 3, and this is the outline. All right, so the corruption of U.S. elite institutions of higher education. That's what this chapter is about. Okay, there's a causal connection, you know? This elite institution, this problem is connected to our mismanaged economy. When the economy collapsed, it was all these highly educated people who collapsed it. Lack of universal health care, that's driven by the greed of the privileged. Imperialism in the Mideast, the project for the new American century. Why we invaded Iraq was for cheap oil. And then once we invaded, all these corporations made money, rebuilding Iraq at the expense of Iraq. And of course, Iraq hasn't come together very well. Surprise, surprise. It's racist because Germany came together after World War II. Well, we gave them money, plus we didn't intervene. We allowed Germany to rebuild itself. Whereas in Iraq, we didn't allow the Iraqis. As I said before, we brought in our American corporations. Almost a vast majority of the profits went to American corporations. They even brought in Filipinos to do the work. My goodness, I can't believe how corrupt it is. But anyway, these are people educated in these fancy schools. They only do a mediocre job of teaching students to question and think. And there's no self-criticism. Obviously, Mark Zuckerberg feels sorry for himself. He's not self-critical. None of those guys in the reading last time question or think or are self-critical. And this is what Mr. Dershowitz said. What is college for? It's for you to learn how to do that. Just as a matter of course, it becomes part of who you are. You go through life and you go, wait a sec. And it's not just criticizing everything. It's being able to distinguish what's worth criticizing and what should you accept. Okay? Instead, private companies pay for students to get higher scores on tests. The private schools, the AP classes. So I think later on in this outline, Mr. Hedges talks about his son who read all the time, but he scored pretty low on the SAT reading part of the SAT exam. And the thing is, I'm the same way. Like, I don't know if I read a lot in high school. I thought a lot in high school. I did a lot of thinking. I used to take these long walks and think like crazy. I didn't even really know what I was thinking about. It was just that part of my brain was just very active. And I didn't score well on the SAT. So I went and bought a book on how to do better on the SAT. But I never scored that well because I didn't have a huge vocabulary, because I didn't read that much. I thought too much. And my thinking was at a much less verbose level. I didn't get involved in sophisticated words. I just wanted to think about things like what is justice? The Vietnam War, what is truth? What is beauty? My mother was an art history prof. So anyway, yeah, you can buy your kid um, acceptance to the elite schools. There's a lot of information about the high schools that are feeder schools for these elite schools, and all the teachers there know their marching orders, what they need to teach those kids to get them high scores, to get them looking good on their college application. Um, it creates blind deference to authority, okay? And competent systems managers. So what they want to crank out are people who can get these jobs where they fit into the system and they manage the system. They're the guy on top. They don't question the free market, and it's self-justifying. So even though we had a market collapse, we do not have regulations in place to prevent it from happening again. There was a bill passed, but it was watered down. One of the two people who signed on to the bill was totally frustrated because he knew we're just we're heading for the same type of thing. We've got new products that are so complicated, nobody bothers to read them, but they're not regulated. So we're just waiting for another collapse to happen. There's no search for the common good. The societal play of yeah, okay. So Mr. Hedges talks about the country could appear to be the same. You still have representatives and senators and all that, but the spirit behind it is really totally different. So I think that people have caught on to that Trump versus Harris is very different from Eisenhower, when Eisenhower ran in the 50s, or John Kennedy versus Nixon or something like that. So um, our country has changed, and Mr. Hedges is pointing that out. So in the next class, I think his final chapter is about um, how America changed in the last 50, 40 years. Okay, after 9/11, this was a big change. I know because I remember it very clearly. I was living in Arkansas. I had just gotten there like 4 years earlier, and there was a huge wave of anti-liberalism. Oh boy, I was the target of so many Christian Baptist fundamentalist ministers said, Jerry Falwell, I remember, said, God allowed 9/11 to happen because our nation was being taken over by the relativists, the feminists, the gays, the liberals. And my students, one of them came and told me, Dr. Beck, you're not going to like what Jerry Falwell said. And I said, well, what did he say? And I said, well, I understand it because I remember reading something when he was in college. There was a professor, probably a philosophy professor, who said the first day of class, I'm going to beat the religion out of you. And Jerry Falwell's parents were probably paying a lot of money for him to go to college, and that's really offensive. So, of course, there's going to be a backlash. But the problem is, of course, it backlashed too far. Jerry Falwell has a son who is clearly corrupt. He is on the board of Liberty University that his father founded, but he's just in it for the money. He gives contracts to all his friends to build all the buildings. And then he was engaged, he would have these sex by the swimming pool parties. And he and his wife had this guy who was kind of having sex with both of them. And he got, in trouble. He's corrupt. And another Billy Graham was another minister who sort of came out after 9/11. And his son, Franklin Graham, is also very corrupt, totally into power. So um, I just think, again, you have to think critically. You can't go whole hog one side or the other. I understood Jerry Falwell's problem. I was mad at liberals myself. I wrote books against a very prominent liberal, Martha Nussbaum. I just railed at her, but nobody reads my books, but at least I got it said. Okay, so Christian nationalists, I'm not patriotic enough. Neoconservatives, which is the free market, cut taxes, market fundamentalists. Neoconservatives were the project for the new American century that went and invaded Iraq for cheap oil. So all of them attacked the academy. And that's true. I remember that. Uh, yeah, they were against liberal arts and yeah, it was a hard time. The neoconservatives had wanted to invade Iraq and set up military bases. That was called the Project for the New American Century. They had their mission statement. I'm not making this up. Like, this isn't fake news, and I didn't get it off some weird site. I got it right after 9/11, a printout, because they used to have a web page just explicitly telling you who they are. And then it went down. It's too bad because I had planned to send my students to it. So they knew I wasn't making this up. But then they shut it down. So, okay. The market fundamentalists have a model of rationality, which we will talk about later also in the Enlightenment with John Locke and Adam Smith. But they had this model where it's virtuous to act in a way that's based on your calculation of the most efficient means to your personal economic interest. So the people who sent us to Iraq were on the boards of the huge corporations that were benefiting from the war and from the aftermath. They were profiting from the war. And so going to war was something they wanted to sell the public to make money. There was a spokesperson for the president, communications guy that comes out and deals with the journalists. And his name was Andrew Card. And the Iraq War, Bush and his father had been together in early August or late July. And then a few weeks later, the saber rattling began. We got to go to war against Saddam. Saddam's an evil guy. He's got weapons of mass destruction, which he didn't have. And the people knew that. He's the cause behind the Project for New American Century. They knew those were lies. Right after 9/11, there was an email that said, we have to associate this in the public mind with Saddam so we can go get him. It was never true. Saddam, the bombing was by Al-Qaeda, fundamentalist Muslims, but Saddam didn't like fundamentalist Muslims and Al-Qaeda, and he kept them out of Iraq. But now Iraq is full of fundamentalist Muslims and all sorts of stuff. So the people who brought us into that war just got rich off of it. And I don't think very many people in your generation even know that. It's sad because you've got to know the history in order to understand what's going on right now, too. Okay, so the military-industrial academic complex. So Eisenhower in the 1950s, after World War II, he was in World War II. He hated war, which is good, I think most people who are actually in wars hate wars. people who send us to war are not people who ever were in a war, and they're people who make money off of war. This is not a good way to set up a society. But he was worried about people making profits from war, and then politicians, corporations constantly saber rattling, create this enemy to justify war to make money. And then, of course, they want to believe they're the good guys, that we really do need to go after so and so, and that war solves problems. War does not solve problems, it makes problems worse. And we did not, war has not solved our problems. Um, Corporations and the Pentagon give money to universities for research. Okay, so now all these college professors um, make their living and get their status from studying products, services that are ultimately going to be used to kill people for war. And their research is controlled by the profit motive. The professors, on the other hand, professors, especially in humanities, there has been this turn toward postmodernism, which is just constructing social reality and creating all these very specialized network jargon, trivial issues. They set up journals and publishing houses that reinforce their works. They pat each other on the back. They give each other status for their mental gymnastics, right? I had to read a lot of that stuff. It was exhausting to figure out what it said. And then by the time I figured it out, I said, well, that's not true. Mostly I thought if that were true, there would be no difference between philosophy and sophistry. And sorry, I draw the line there. There has to be a difference. If you don't have a view of reality that doesn't distinguish between good and evil, you're in trouble. Between love of wisdom and appearance of the love of wisdom in order to gain money, power, and status, sorry, you got to throw that one out. So it took me a long time to figure out what I did think, because all the way through grad school, I had to respond to what I didn't think, but I still had to mold myself to figure out what these people were saying and find a way to relate to it in a way that they would give me the degree. I could move on. But it's also Mr. Hedges, when he's talking to his friend, he had been at Harvard Divinity School. He just decided not to become a minister and to go into the journalism. But he talked to a former friend who had gone there, and she was teaching there, and he couldn't even understand what she said. And he's like, no dummy. But then they're snobs, like, oh, the masses are, low life and stupid. They vote for Trump. And it's so polarizing, and it's not at all appropriate, because intellectuals should be calling out the way that privileged people pull the wool over the eyes of people that just can't handle all that indoctrination, manipulation. And now these philosophers are hiding away in their offices, just running away from it all and thinking they're so virtuous and criticizing the masses for voting for Trump, which they don't understand why somebody would. I lived below the poverty line for 10 years when I was first married. I had one kid, I had two kids. Right before I had a third kid, my husband got an entry-level, more decent job, not a minimum wage job. But still, I'm sure we still live below the poverty line. So I know what it feels like to have little kids and protect them from all the dangers when you live in a neighborhood that's low income. And the grievances that people have, that the rich keep getting richer, it's totally understandable to me. The difference is I don't think Trump is interested in helping people with their problems, but I really resent the fact that trained philosophers hide in their offices and polarize and denigrate other people. Socrates talked to anybody. He'd go out in the marketplace. Anybody could come and listen. And his language was very simple. And people loved it. Middle class, lower class people. They understood the questions. They understood that this elitist guy couldn't answer the question. They knew the person was getting humiliated. So Socrates communicated with everybody and he kept things simple, not like many professors today. They focus on attacking opposite points of view. And then when he was at Berkeley, he went to a place where people were signing up, but it was just none of it was being critical of greed and power lust. All it was self-interest or entertainment, or ethnic identity. It's like a tribe, resume building. So you're worried about your profession. They're not critical of the corporations that donate to the university. The private schools, in private schools, all the dorms are fancy. In universities, if you can believe this, I think it's so undemocratic. And this is our future leadership class. Even people who get into Harvard, blah, blah, there's the richest Harvard, blah, blah kids. And then there's the ones that were let in, and they live in lower quality dorms. Oh my gosh. So you have to make sure you know who's the richest of the richest. Boy, that is so undemocratic. And it's so much like what was happening in Athens. And it's so much like when Aristotle says greed destroys political association. So British Petroleum paid researchers in universities for research on biofuels. The football tickets, the coach is the highest paid employee. The tuition was rising above the cost of living. The number of people in management and staff went up 257%. Employee overall 24, and faculty, the number of faculty only went up 1% in the same time. The admissions couldn't accept thousands of qualified applicants because of money. But if the people on the board who make over 100 grand were willing to pay 1% from their salaries, everyone could have been let in, and they refused to do it. Like, why are they on that board? They are not on that board to help the school reach out to more than just the elite. So they must be on the board to maintain their status as elites and to shut out anybody who's less than the top, I don't know, 10, 15%. They raised $1 billion for athletics instead of giving to the kids who qualified for Berkeley but didn't have all that money. Oh boy, so students will join the military to pay for college. So all of a sudden college campuses promote war, they glorify the military. The Greeks, that was the Ares, be careful not to overvalue war. You should value diplomacy more than war. The regents were supposed to be elected, but they're actually appointed by their friends. So it's just a old boy network that's forgotten their obligation to society, ecology, and democratic ideals. Berkeley is just totally gone. And they have high security laboratories doing research on nuclear technology rather than on ecology, environmental, green energy. So, and he's just taking this as an example of what's going on in all of these universities. So the jargon, Harvard Divinity School, one of his friends who he knew from there, who has gone on to teach, and he couldn't understand what she was talking about. She wasn't questioning the system. She wasn't teaching her kids to question, but she did have this contempt for the masses, the non-elite. Like the system had corrupted her. So there's no connection. It's a kind of illiteracy to not be able to communicate between people, to not be able to use language in a way that connects to your basic humanity and to the foundations of Western culture, i.e., the Greeks, for one, that you need a language that enables everyone to talk about the serious questions and the common good and democracy. So again, that's what Socrates did. And everyone does need to talk about the serious questions and what's happening to our society in relation to those questions. Literature is a way to enlighten societies about their ills, but students are not majoring in English anymore. They're majoring in finance or some other STEM type of disciplines. Reading the classics is not considered practical or useful. So I do want to convey to you that Aristotle and Plato are very practical and very useful. We're not learning the lessons from the past. Yes, the foundation of Athenian democracy. Hello, Mr. Hedges. I didn't pay him to say that. He just has this old-fashioned education that I also got because I'm his age, that I'm trying to pass on, but it's heavy lifting. It rose out of the egalitarian social and political reforms of Solon, who was Plato's uncle. If you remember on my little slideshow where I pretended to be Plato, I said my uncle Solon wrote the Constitution, and he was a political genius. His decision to wipe out all the debts because people were too many citizens were bankrupt and they could not participate in public life. You can also read the classics to find out what was going on in the Roman Empire, the fall of Rome, and then mostly just to get over your American exceptionalism. Like, we are not unique. We can make the same mistakes, and we ought to admit that. Like, Americans can have this pride and this greed that is just going to destroy us. It's already destroyed us in a lot of ways. It's just that as long as I teach, I've got to constantly say, it could get worse. So stop the bleeding, stop the downward spiral. We need to learn the lessons wise people have passed down in order to that future generations won't make those mistakes. We live in an illusion. We're deluded about our power, our vulnerability, and our virtue. And again, on your posts, I want you to write, does that resonate with you? Do you think this is true? The children of the elite, usually my students get pretty galled about this because they're not children of the elite. They think they have their advantages they have because they earned them, and they didn't. Their parents set up the system so that they would win. And they learn to disdain people for those who are less privileged. They form a tribe, right? They live in these elite communities, they're isolated. So you go to an expensive country club and an expensive, country club, and that's where you swim and you play golf and you just hang out with your other rich buddies, and you go to this either private school or suburban school, and you're isolated. You go to a church. Again, the church is just a mega church, and it's just feeding into the greed. We have this thing about prosperity gospel, right? If you're rich, you're somehow blessed by God. Oh my gosh. You use religion to baptize this. There's meaningless charities. So rich folk get tax breaks from giving to charity. But for example, the Cancer Society. Oh, it sounds like you're so generous, you care about cancer, but you do nothing to try and prevent cancer because of the pollution and the stress. These are the real causes of cancer. Even if you can't spot a one-on-one connection, that's what Mr. Mate said, it's a toxic culture. But none of this charity tries to make the culture less toxic. It really just reinforces it. So the one that kind of galls me is the children's hospital for cancer in Memphis or something, St. Jude. Oh, those poor children. Well, yeah. Why do they get cancer? What happened? Like, what is going on in our food system, our air, our all these things? We're not doing anything to prevent it. And then you're getting this tax break from coming across as branding yourself, right? I'm the charitable brand of rich businessman. Ugh, it's self-delusion. They're in a state of perpetual childhood. They never have to grow up. And that's what Kara Swisher said about Mark Zuckerberg and others, right? He's just naive about evil. He lives in a bubble. And that's what Paris means in the Iliad. The Trojan War started because the son, the prince, the son of Priam in Troy, went and stole Helen from Menelaus. He stole somebody else's wife. And he just thought if he likes her, he gets her. He gets whatever he wants. And he brought her back to Troy, and the the priests said, don't take her, don't let her in. Told his father, don't let him bring her in because the Achaeans will come and this will be a war. But Priam spoils his little baby boy. So he's the spoiled brat rich kid, and we have spoiled brat diplomats kids, and we have spoiled brat whatever in the privileged class. They get whatever they want. Partly their parents are not home, and so they feel guilty, so they go buy a ski lodge in Aspen and they go skiing for the Christmas. And it's just this incredible bubble separated from everyone else. That's not democracy. So the poor and the working class are on their own. They have to go to work. They work endless hours. The living wage has not gone up and has gone down over the last 40 years, 50 years. The price of education is higher. The price of housing is higher. The price of food is higher, but the incomes have not gone up. Most elite is based on race and ethnicity, not class, but it turns out to be quite a bit from class. So Berkeley, for example, can say that they have 30% of their incoming class is diverse, right? It's not white and Western. It's not American or it's not white. Well, it turns out it's this international elite class. So he was speculating, right? A Taiwanese hedge fund manager has his daughter gets into Harvard and she gets to count as diversity. She's the same spoiled brat rich kids that all the other kids are there. To get a higher SAT score. That's right, about his son. He paid $7,000, How many people can afford that? And then the tutor told his son, stop thinking about whether a passage is true. You're wasting time thinking about the ideas. Just spit back what they tell you. And his score went way up. I remember telling myself when I took that SAT, stop thinking, because I usually spent the weekend thinking. And I had read that booklet, so I knew kind of what I had to do. I still remember that because I spent how many days that day? 3 hours, how many hours? I can't remember. It was 3 hour test, 5 hour test. But I remember deliberately not thinking, like turning off that button in my head. I still didn't get, super scores. I got high enough, but the legacy children, my gosh, children of alumni, Harvard 14%. I read recently, I think this book is 2014, but I think 2023 or something was more like 30%. You get in because your daddy went to Harvard. Oh boy. So George W. Bush, he got into his prep school because of his daddy, and he got into Yale because of his daddy, not because of anything that he achieved or earned. And whatever else democracy is supposed to be about, it's supposed to be about merit, that you get in because you deserve it, because you worked hard and you were successful and all that wonderful stuff. I mean, the US was supposed to be this place where you could go move up the social ladder just by work, right? You get a homestead, you, you create wealth, and you can move out of your class position in Europe. Europe had these entrenched classes, but now we have an entrenched class system, even though we call it democracy. It's not. Okay, the biggest donors, their children got in, what, almost 100%, right? 95% of the time, if they're a donor, their children got in, whereas the average acceptance is 10%. Jared Kushner, Ivanka Kushner's husband, which is Donald Trump's daughter. His dad gave Harvard $1 million or millions right before his two sons enrolled, and they both got in. Jared learned how to run his dad's companies during the year or two when his dad was in prison for doing deals with crooks without checking their backgrounds, right? This is the guy who's Donald Trump's son-in-law, who Donald Trump gave him a whole lot of power the first time around. And the Saudis, he made friends with the Saudi prince. And the Saudi prince told the bankers in Saudi Arabia that they should give him $2 billion for a hedge fund for him to use to invest, even though he had never run a hedge fund before. But they had to do it because the prince told him. So Kushner is totally in bed with Saudi Arabia, that is not our friend in a lot of other capacities, also is oil rich. Why are they so rich? Because we didn't go green when Jimmy Carter told us to in the 70s, or when Al Gore told us to long ago. If we had gone green, we wouldn't have these toxic relationships with Mideast countries. Now, there's a war going on, and it's getting messier and messier. And if we didn't, it's all related to the wealth they have from oil. Okay, so Mr. Hedges says we have to teach the humanities, the life of the mind. So that's what Mr. Dershowitz said. What is college for? To get you to awaken your mind, your capacity to reflect and see analogies, right? The point of the lessons of those books was the guy who wrote it said, I know that this is going to be a problem in the future, Western imperialism. So whoever reads it in the future, our superiority complex, our pride and delusion, they should be able to recognize that this is still a problem. The humanities runs by analogies. And the reason analogies work is because we still have those two drives, pleasure and fear. And we still engage, we still have all the same vices that Aristotle talks about, which I'm sure you know, because when I was reading them, they must have come to mind. And then I asked you to actually write in your post about examples of when you tried to find the mean between extremes. But professors often do not mention our current situation because it might offend the donors who are heavily invested in the status quo. Okay, this is not true of my professor, but I didn't go to one of those. I did go to a fancy school first a couple years and I got totally turned off. So I went to a much less fancy school and I had this really great professor. And he used to say things like, now there's the 25-mile rule. Like, nothing around here is like this, right? We're different. We're special. So 25 miles. Then we read another Plato dialogue. 25-mile rule. Down there at Carl, there's a fancy school 35 miles away. That happens at Carl, right? Not here, not Hamlin. We're the greatest. We're different. Case method system, it never questions the free market. And Socratic search for wisdom, right? This is, again, what I've said, and Mr. Hedges was trained in that. He understands that. He was a preacher's kid in a what's called a mainline church that unites reason and faith. There's a natural transition from growing up with that worldview to then reading Plato and going, oh, wow, this is kind of like Jesus, kind of like the prophets, kind of like all the stuff I grew up in church. My dad would preach about this. Yeah. So in his search for wisdom, what you learn is things are complicated. There's better and worse ways to address a problem, and there's more situations that need to be addressed. And that was why Aristotle has his view of practical wisdom, is the person who can hit the mark, who can do what's best in a situation for the right reason in the right way. They can figure out what the real options are, not utopian or cynical. Which one is best, why, articulate it, and then they're self-correcting. Okay, and so there's this constant deliberation. And in Homer, Plato, tragedy, people are deliberating. So you have the plot line, and then every once in a while, there's this little scene where people are deliberating. Same with Thucydides' Peloponnesian War. And then they'd go along a little, and there's some more deliberations. And I really liked that literature, but I didn't quite know why. And then I finally put it together. It's because they're engaged in deliberation. So, for example, in Aeschylus' Agamemnon, there's 5 characters that know that Zeus is on their side. I'm doing this for Zeus. Zeus. Well, that means it's just, right? I'm the just person. I know what I'm doing is just. Well, there's 5 of them, and they completely disagree. But the chorus are the ones that are closest to the truth. And they start out in the play saying, I don't know anything. I'm so confused. My country has been taken over by the queen, and she's sleeping with Agamemnon's arch enemy, and he's not coming. And I don't know what to do. And I don't know if there's a God anywhere that cares about us, right? They have a crisis. And gradually, they start noticing the patterns. Those who kill will be killed. Those who spoil their children will have them grow up to be monsters like Paris that take the whole city down and they don't even care. So gradually, the chorus starts to see the patterns. And they also make a mistake, but they self-correct. And that's the model that citizens are supposed to follow. This play was written early on when Athens was just becoming a democracy. So it's very important that the people get educated to be citizens by example, by watching the course. They actually played out the Oresteia, this 3-part tragedy, every year, which makes sense to me. Anyway, okay, personal problems that are solved through, some of them are solved through skills, but overall, the culture, the direction and the values of the culture matter. The academy only trains people for analytic reasoning, not the mind. Social, emotional intelligence and creativity are not cultivated. So that would be Aristotle's moral virtues as opposed to the intellectual virtues. And he even says that intelligence is morally neutral. Society educates Aristotle's intellectual virtues, but not the moral virtues. Students are socialized to succeed, to obey, to be afraid to take risks, and to fear failure. And those are irrational fears. In courage, that's one of the things we fear, but this has gone too far. The appearance of learning, right? They appear to be smart or wise or accomplished, but it's not. It's just self-interest versus what education should be, part of a larger intellectual journey, a spiritual quest. So that's also what Mr. Dershowitz said. He saw a student at the library reading a book about how to win at college is just a game, so you can come out and get a really good job. Now, Mr. Hedges said, what is the humanities? What is its value? And this is the same thing Dershowitz said about great ideas. Your students are exposed to the best that has been thought and said, but there's a huge decline in humanities majors and in the number of requirements. So I taught at a school that at one point you had to take 3 theology and 3 philosophy or something. 2 philosophy, you had to take a lot. It was a Catholic school. But now, nobody makes students do these things. Liberal arts schools are marketed as a way to look better, get a better job, not the substance of what you learn or character. Again, the book Evidence Liberal Arts Needs, the first day, the second day of class, was about the substance of what liberal arts is supposed to do for you. Since 1900, capitalists and industrialists have denigrated liberal arts. Since 1990, liberal arts colleges have closed. A huge percentage of professors, like 2/3 of them, are adjuncts. They aren't around. They just drive in. They have completely different lives. Programs are cut. History is cut. How can anyone learn what we need to know with no knowledge of history and of these patterns, right? If you get taught history as more minutia, or, it's totally different than us, of course, you're not learning anything. And so the administrators think the students hate it, they're not learning anything, so we'll just cut it. I mean, you have to teach it in a way that actually makes it obvious. You really should know. Now, since Trump was elected the first time, there's many historians who are coming out and with these books about the rise of authoritarianism. And they start out saying history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. So the idea that history rhymes is analogies. And so there's a book called Strongman, there's a book called On Tyranny, and there's a book called How Democracies Die. And they're all writing because they see analogies between what they've studied for their whole career and what's going on in the USA. That's helpful, but that's not deconstruction. That's not socially, everything is socially constructed. That's that we have these same old drives and they keep coming up, and greed, power hunger, and lust. They take a country down. And here we go again. But we're denying it, right? We're flying from humanities is to run away from our conscience. So The rich are getting richer. They have no qualms about destroying public education, public health care, selling people weapons to dictators. They don't have any problem with it. They don't probably just don't even know or don't try to know. Um, Legislation was offered to Congress to prevent the financial collapse, but the corporate and banking industry lobbyists paid for political campaigns in exchange for voting against it. So we have incredible corruption with money in politics. In order to resist evil, we have to have reflection, moral autonomy. You have to be able to speak out, the courage not to cooperate. And that's moral courage. It's a kind of courage. Advertisers, the manipulative character. Social sciences aim to study behavior in order to control it. So people do what you want them to do and what solves your interests. There are character types that run corporations or that are successful at advertising that are similar to mentally ill people, right? People that get diagnosed as you don't want to come near this person ends up to be the CEO of a company. So universities are training people for jobs that will not exist based on a structure that will collapse, and it will collapse because we have to move to a green energy future, and we're not doing it. So few courses emphasize that at all. It's really shocking. And I don't think students are getting what they need. But anyway, so that's one thing. The next read is about is Dershowitz. This one's shorter. The rest of them are shorter. Come on. Okay. Elite education, the outline. This is a shorter outline. Okay. He says, Ivy retardation. That's a great expression. He's retarded because he spent his life as an undergraduate, graduate, and teaching in Ivy League uh, communities, and he's retarded. He says he starts out saying he had to stay home because the plumber was coming. He couldn't think of anything to say to the plumber. And then how far that is from Socrates. You know, Socrates was a stonecutter. He talked to anyone. He's pointing out how anti-democratic it is. Elite institutions will never admit to their flaws. So that's arrogance, right? Lack of self-knowledge. They flatter their students. They flatter themselves for being able to give their students the best jobs, education. It's a fake meritocracy. There's another guy named Michael Sandel who also has books about meritocracy and the way the system's set up so that you appear to be able to earn your acceptance into these schools, but it's not really true. Yeah, so he talks about the tutoring, admissions frenzy, globalization has led to economic insecurity. People want their kids to have an advantage. Diversity means the children of rich business people and professionals from around the world. The presidential candidates were all from this class, although it got worse. You know, Bob Dole actually went to University of Kansas, not Harvard and Yale, but just there's so much privilege in the system who gets in. Barack Obama did pull himself up. He got some scholarships to go to college. But when he was in charge, his decisions often did lead to a gap. I don't think he intended it, but that's where it went. Okay, John McCain. He actually wanted campaign finance reform. He was not as privileged, but he chose Sarah Palin as a very poor choice, who wasn't at all like him. Um, and the Supreme Court made a decision, Citizens United, where campaign finance reform is completely out, and anybody can give as much money as they want. So politics is corrupted by money. Mitt Romney was a vulture capitalist. He doesn't really make money. He just buys out other companies. That's the monopoly problem. Hillary Clinton versus Donald Trump. So Donald Trump claimed to represent the working class, but that's not true. The first time around, he appointed billionaires, sorry, not millionaires. And they prevented the laws from being enforced because it's to their economic benefit. Then Biden was actually from a working class background. Harris had diversity and she worked her way up. But now Trump, since the second election, he's obviously letting Elon Musk and the super rich guys, Peter Thiel, they're running things right now. I don't know how long that's going to last. Steve Bannon, he's the guy who likes Trump because of the working class claims. He has got it out for Musk. And so there might be some kind of a fallout between those two branches. But the elite, they're unable to talk to most people because they're taught that people aren't worth talking to. There are some smart people who don't bother. And there are other forms of intelligence, social intelligence, emotional intelligence, creativity. Humanistic education is focused on leadership, but to preserve a free society and well-structured laws to create a middle class. All religious traditions, elite education is against religion usually, but all of them condemn pride, arrogance, and they have any sort of false sense of self-worth. Your worth is caught up in your numbers, your scores. You should figure out your natural ability, and you should not just keep trying to mold yourself to whatever's trendy or whatever can make you the most money. The old boy network, which is now also an old girl network. You deserve more because of your test scores, which is not true. The campuses are walled and locked. I have gone to conferences at Rhodes and I really can't stand it. It's so bad. And it's in a kind of poor neighborhood. And so the people who wait on you in the food service, the food service is incredibly opulent, infinite number of choices. The people working there, you can tell, are poor and struggling. He talks about in Yale, everybody gets a second chance. Everybody gets an A minus, or their parents call up and complain. Whereas he had a friend at Cleveland State who was a waitress, and she handed in a paper late because she was finishing her shift because the one who was supposed to come didn't come. And she got a D. Like, who's the teacher that does that? All these other advantages they have. Performance grants, all these other grants that again makes the kid look so brilliant, so wonderful. Grade inflation is a terrible problem. The college experience prepares students for adult life. They're entitled. The Cleveland State person is not going to get a second chance. They're not going to get support. They're going to have to struggle all their life to have a decent middle-class job. But the Yale person will never get kicked out no matter what. And then when they go get the big job, they make these huge mistakes, financial collapse, but they get bailed out and they don't pay a price. They make contacts at work and at their social clubs, and it's handed to them. They also are afraid of failure. They don't want to be teachers because, oh my goodness, I'm sacrificing my parents a huge amount of money they paid for me to get this education. It just means anybody with curiosity, creativity is wiped out. But what you should do is follow your calling and be an intellectual. This makes minds, not careers. You're passionate about ideas. Life is an intellectual journey, a pilgrimage, and you ask the big questions. Liberal arts institutions, it's still possible to have a conversion experience, to find your way out of the cave of conformity to the light of love of wisdom and your own passion. Research institutions are a terrible problem. Being an intellectual means thinking your way toward a vision of the good society and then trying to realize that vision by speaking truth to power. It means going into spiritual exile. So the tyranny of the normal is upon us, and it's not just the masses, it's the tyranny of the elite, not stepping out, not not showing leadership. And his students, he says, they can't possibly be alone. They're not used to solitude. That's partly because of that social media. But solitude is necessary for introspection. Introspection is necessary for having an intellectual life. And that's what Socrates, the Greeks, tell you. An unexamined life is not worth living. So many people are excellent sheep. They have a lot of achievements, but not experience, and great success, but no vision. They don't have any character strength. They can't deal with obstacles. And Mark Zuckerberg and all those folks are good examples of what's going on, the corruption in the academy. And the one more short one was just a short article in the Chronicle of Higher Education. And you can read it over. It's not long. It's just how the philosophers' blogs are so arrogant, and they're just intellectually corrupt, arrogant, black and white thinking, self-important, putting down other people. It's shocking, and I don't like my students to know how bad the professor it is, because we're supposed to be role models. But that's why Jerry Falwell, I understand why he thought God allowed 9/11 to happen, because our country was getting taken over by these rotten elites. And there's, Trump is always talking about the rotten elites, and I understand him. It's just that Trump himself is also rotten. So it's more complicated than that. And you have to be a critical thinker. So in your generation, you are definitely going to have to be a leader. We will have this huge transition to a green energy economy. There will be many disruptions, and you will have to step up. My students, they can step up in their communities, go back to their smaller towns or some sub-community where they live. They can show leadership just for the fun of it, or for the satisfaction that you get out of it, not as some kind of duty. But how else would you want to live? What sort of legacy do you want to leave behind? When you're looking back, what do you want to be able to tell yourself about what you did with your life? Your one beautiful life full of all this potential. What do you want to do with it? Don't ask somebody else. Reflect yourself. Who am I? What do I love to do that I feel is meaningful, that contributes? Do I have the talent for it? And then do whatever you have to do to get the licensing, knowing there are going to be a lot of obstacles. This is not easy. You suffer a lot. You suffer unjustly. You suffer justly. You suffer this way and that way. But it's worth it in the end.